Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see many of you in person after speaking with many of you virtually about demographics over the past number of years. As you know, over the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about demographics, particularly immigration, the impact it's had on population growth. The government has reacted to some of the numbers and some of these implications, announced some changes. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is to take you through. First of all, have a look at population growth. Where has the population been growing? A little bit about why it's been growing, which is really important. And look at the national picture, what's happened regionally, and then look behind the scenes at the two big components of population growth: international migration, the two strands, both permanent residents and temporary or non-permanent residents, and then internal migration. We hear a lot less about internal migration these days, but it's important, particularly in some regions, and in some cases, it adds to the immigration impact. In other cases, it balances off the immigration impact. And we'll have a look at how those two mix together, and we'll end with a little bit of what we expect to see. We expect to see some pretty major changes in terms of growth over the next 2 or 3 years, and we'll talk about that. So to start off with growth at the national level, this chart shows annual growth in Canada for the past nearly 20 years. And you can see for many years our growth was pretty stable, in and around 1% a year, started increasing around 2015 a little bit, the pandemic hit, and then it really skyrocketed. In the last 2 years, we've had growth in and around 2.5% to 3% a year. Unprecedented, that we haven't seen for many, many years. Probably one of the highest growth rates in the world, with the exception perhaps of a number of sub-Saharan countries. So what's behind that? Well, as you probably well know, it's all about international migration. And this chart shows the components of that growth broken up into mostly the two strands of immigration. One, permanent immigration, people who come to the country with the idea of staying here for the long term, becoming eligible for citizenship, and the other, non-permanent or temporary migration. These are mostly students, temporary workers, some asylum claimants as well. And you can see for many years, permanent immigration was earning in and around 250,000 a year or so. These are net numbers, so it accounts a little bit for an outflow. But you can see how around 2022, numbers really kicked up. And that's a direct result of government policy that I'll talk a little bit about. The other extreme, non-permanent residents, really wasn't terribly important for population growth for many years. In and around, slightly positive, negative in a couple of years, picked up around 2015, plummeted, and then skyrocketed the last couple of years. You can see around last year, 800,000, that's a net number, added to our population. And if you look at the last 2 years and add both permanent residents and temporary residents together, we've added somewhere around 2.3 million people to our population. Just to put that in perspective, that's essentially the total population of the Atlantic region in our country, the total population of Manitoba and Saskatchewan combined. So tremendous, tremendous growth that's resulted in many issues that we hear a lot about. And as a result, the government has reacted and has announced some changes that we'll come back to. Internal migration receives, as I mentioned, a lot less attention, been pretty stable. This is the number of interprovincial migrants every year, in and around 300,000 people moving from one province to another. But that picked up post-pandemic, up to somewhere close to 350,000. The reasons for the pickup, hard to say. Some of it might be pent-up demand for moving that couldn't happen during the pandemic. The ability to work remotely probably contributed to that. And as we'll see, the price of housing in our large urban areas likely contributed to that as well. So for a number of reasons, but more migration both between provinces and, if you look down below, between metropolitan areas as well. So how has all this played out? So I've put together here the last 2 years, post-pandemic period, and looked at the growth rate for these 2 years for each of the provinces. And I've broken out the two components. One, the big non-permanent resident or temporary resident component, and the rest, which is basically immigration, interprovincial migration, and a little bit of natural increase. Natural increase, that is the excess of births over deaths, really is not an issue anymore in population growth. We're balancing out births and deaths. And you can see a couple of things on this chart. If we look at the Canada level, about half of all our growth over the last 2 years was due to non-permanent residents, students and temporary workers. If you look at BC and Ontario, even more than half. For example, in Ontario, the growth rate was 5%. Under half of that was really immigration and provincial migration. More than half was temporary. Temporary was less important in places like Alberta, the Maritime provinces, but still played a big role. So a lot of the growth right across the country has been due to that non-permanent or temporary migration. We're going to look at that in a little more detail a little bit later on. If we drill down a little bit to metropolitan areas, we can see a range of growth. The Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo area, the fastest growing metropolitan area, but if you look at why that was, basically a large influx of international students, temporary workers into the Kitchener area fueled that high growth. If you take that out, much more modest growth. Areas like Calgary, Halifax, Saskatoon, certainly the temporary migration important, but they were growing as a result of immigration and to some extent, certainly in Calgary, interprovincial migration. So you can see a variation in why different areas are growing. And that's important going forward because, as we'll see, if that number of non-permanent residents comes down, we're going to revert to a pattern of growth similar to the darkened bars here. The other thing that's been happening is in smaller urban areas, we've seen some pretty good growth. And again, different reasons for this. The Squamish area out in BC really growing very rapidly, all of it on the basis of internal migration, people moving there from other parts of BC, from other parts of the country, and a small amount of international migration. The other extreme, you see Cape Breton really grew as well. Virtually all of the growth in Cape Breton due heavily to the influx of international students into the Cape Breton area. Similar in places like Sault Ste. Marie, Sarnia, and North Bay. Lots of temporary migrants fueled that high growth. In other areas, good growth in Charlottetown, in Canmore, in Tillsonburg, for example, growth due to interprovincial migration combined with international migration. So that's the big picture in terms of where growth has been. Let's look a little bit behind the scenes now in terms of those two components of migration. First of all, immigration, and then we'll look at internal migration. Here's the immigration numbers, as I mentioned, for many years in and around 250,000, but really started to escalate post-pandemic. And this year we're expecting somewhere around 485,000, nearly double the traditional levels pre-pandemic. And those levels are set by the federal government once a year, who announce immigration targets for 3 years. The latest targets being for 485,000 this year and 500,000 for the next 2 years. Now those targets get revised every year, end of October, early November. The government has to report to Parliament and announce the targets for the next 3 years. And so I'll come back to that. We may see some changes to that. The data we have for the first 6 months of this year, a little over 255,000. So we're on track to hit very close to 500,000 target for this year. Very similar to the last couple of years. One of the important points when we talk about permanent residents is that all new permanent residents aren't recent arrivals in Canada. Some have been in the country for 4, 5, 6 years. A fairly frequent, increasingly frequent path to permanent residency is to come in as a student, get a degree after 2 or 4 or 5 years, apply for Canadian work permit, gain Canadian experience for a couple of years, and then apply and get permanent residency. And you can see that last year, for the last couple of years, somewhere around 40% of all the new permanent residents were actually not new arrivals in the country, but had been here for a number of years, many as students or temporary workers. But 60% were actually new arrivals to the country. Where are immigrants settling? No surprise, they settled in the big provinces, Ontario, BC, Alberta. But if you put the numbers in perspective of the population of these areas, we see a somewhat different picture. For Ontario, BC, and Alberta, the immigration numbers represent per 1,000 total population, somewhere around 12 or 13%. About half that level in Quebec. Quebec has an explicit policy of holding down the number of immigrants every year, and it shows. But if you look at the smaller provinces, for example, Saskatchewan and PEI, their ratios are over 20%. So in terms of the size of their population, immigration is even more important to them than it is to Ontario and BC. And in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, even Newfoundland and Labrador, in and around the same level per capita as the big provinces. Where are immigrants coming from? We saw in a presentation this morning, some of you may have caught, over a third of our immigrants last year came in from India. There's permanent residents, 138,000 of the 471,000. China, the Philippines followed. But we see a number of new countries that traditionally haven't been countries for the origin of our immigrants. Afghanistan, a bit of a special case, nearly 20,000 immigrants. And we see a number of African countries starting to show up. And we saw this beginning about 10 years ago. Numbers are small, but you see Nigeria now, the 5th highest, the Cameroons, the 6th. Go down further, Eritrea. So the African countries starting to see migration into Canada. And here you can see the changes that have taken place. We talked about how the total numbers have increased. This compares 2015 with 2023, numbers going from 270,000 to 470,000. And you can see how the numbers from India went from 40,000 to 140,000. But changes in other countries, for example, the Philippines, that was for a number of years the #1 country, dropped down from about 50,000 to half that level. And those African countries, as I mentioned, all increasing in numbers. So a bit of a shift in terms of the makeup of our immigrants. And although that's the national picture, one of the things that's important for your markets, for your local markets, is there's a different mix across the country. In many of the provinces and regions, India is the #1 country, with the exception of Quebec, no surprise. But then we see some differences. The Philippines being second in the Atlantic area, and also out west in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. We see the African countries showing up in the top 3, particularly in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Afghanistan showing up high. So a different mix of immigrants as we go across the country that's important to keep in mind. So that's the story of permanent numbers. What about the temporary numbers, those numbers that really skyrocketed? Well, if we were tracking the number of temporary permits that the government allocates every year in our New to Canada product. And this data shows from 2015 how those numbers have gradually increased. And I broke them up here into both study permits and work permits. And you can see both really increasing. In the last year, particularly the work permits skyrocketed. Nearly 1.2 million permits were approved. Now again, not all these permits that are approved are new people arriving in country. As was the case with permanent, there's a possibility that permits get renewed, so a person gets a renewed permit, a person moves from being a student to a temporary worker, etc. But about 2/3 last year of all of the approved permits were actually new arrivals into country. About 1/3 were people here moving, renewing a permit, renewing a status, moving from one status to another. Again, important to keep in mind. Where are temporary migrants coming from? Pretty much similar countries to permanent. India, again, at the top, both for students and for temporary workers. But you see Nigeria for students, the second highest now, followed by China and the Philippines. On the temporary side, you see the Ukraine, the #2 country, and that's because the migrants who Canada's accepted from the Ukraine in the last couple of years have been given temporary work permits, and they show up in the data under temporary workers. And you can see countries like Mexico, Colombia, some of the farm workers reflected in that data. So that's the story of the temporary migrants. What about internal migration? Certainly immigration has a major effect right across the country, impacting the growth, and is probably the main reason for growth, certainly in all of the large urban areas. But internal migration comes into play as well. And as I mentioned, we hear a lot less about that, but it can be important, particularly in some areas. So what's been happening on that front? First of all, there are 3 big trends that I've been tracking on internal migration over the last 7 or 8 years. First of all, there was a downturn in the resource industry that affected Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador in and around 2015. What that meant is that traditionally high level of movement to Alberta from the Atlantic region, from Ontario, really turned negative. And Alberta actually lost population for 3 or 4 years to other provinces. However, in the last 2 years, it's really turned around and skyrocketed. Migration to Alberta, most of it from Ontario and BC, really, really high. Why is that? No doubt has something to do with housing prices. If you look at the price of a house in Calgary, it's half of what it is in Vancouver and Toronto, likely driving that growth. Related to that somewhat, but also because of other factors, the Atlantic provinces showed a turnaround in migration. For many, many years, the Atlantic provinces, particularly the maritime provinces, lost population to other parts of the country, many going out to Alberta, going to Ontario. But around 2015, it turned around. Part of the turnaround was a result of the resource problem. People couldn't go to Alberta anymore, so they stayed home, so the number of out-migrants dropped. But they also see people going from Ontario to the Atlantic region in increased numbers. Excuse me. And at around the same time, the maritime provinces started to attract immigrants. For many years, there was hardly any immigration going into Atlantic Canada, but that turned around. And so we had both sort of things happening in the Atlantic region: increased immigration, which, as we saw per capita, is reasonably high, and interprovincial migration. And as a result, we see that high growth in the Atlantic provinces. The third trend, which wasn't new but picked up, was a continuing out-migration from our big cities of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And we'll have a look at that in a minute. And as we saw earlier, overall, an increase in internal mobility. So what's happened at the provincial level? There's 5 provinces last year, or last couple of years, that showed positive migration. Alberta leading the way, the maritime provinces attracting sizable numbers for their population, and the losing provinces mostly being Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, BC, low numbers compared to their population, but numerically high, and that's what's feeding that growth, particularly in Alberta and the Maritime provinces. I mentioned the big three urban areas, and this shows the net migration from the big three areas over the last 15 years or so. Continuing outflow. What's noticeable clearly is what's happened in Toronto. They were losing 20,000 for many years. The last 2 years, for each year, Toronto lost about 120,000 people to other parts, mostly other parts of the province. Similar pattern in Montreal. Numbers aren't quite as high. Vancouver losing a little bit, but not nearly as much. Why is this happening? No doubt part of this, again, can be traced to the cost of housing in these areas, people moving further away until they can qualify and afford a mortgage. And I'm often asked, well, where are these people going who leave these three areas? And we have some data that shows where they're going. No surprise, people leaving Toronto are going to places like Oshawa, Hamilton, Kitchener, Barrie. But sizable numbers are going into what are classified as rural Ontario, rural parts of Simcoe County, up in cottage country, for example. They tend to be more older migrants, retirees moving into these areas. Montreal, the leading place, is outside the metropolitan area. 40% of all the people who left the CMA of Montreal moved to what's classified as rural Quebec, down in the eastern townships, up in the Laurentians. Similarly, in Vancouver, rural BC was the #1 area for migration out of Vancouver, many down in the Fraser Valley, over in the Okanagan, etc., the other cities coming in. So how does internal and international migration come together then? And we can see a little bit of it from what I've just said, but here are the numbers. You can see in places like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and in fact, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and Regina all gain substantially on international migration, but lose internally. So that balances off what would be very high growth from immigration. And you can see still growing at a pretty good numbers, but the two factors opposing one another. In other areas, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, Halifax, both factors contributing to growth, but in most cases, immigration being the dominant factor. And finally, we talk a lot about immigration, about international migration, clearly important for population growth, for growing that consumer base. But what's also important is what I call the population churn that's happening in an area. And that is simply the numbers of people that are moving, whether it's moving in or moving out of an area. And so just to show you how important that can be, and it varies, no surprise, by size of area, you can see in the big urban areas, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population turns over. And this is only looking at migration at the metropolitan area level. Lots of migration within the area. We're not looking at that. In medium-sized areas, Oshawa, Kitchener, etc., 10 to 15% of their population turning over every year. And in small urban areas, 20% of the population turning over. So from a marketing point of view, all of this is impacting on your clients. Clients moving out, clients moving in, changing. So important to look at what I'm calling population churn. Finally, what do we expect over the next couple of years? What's ahead? Well, the big news is on the non-permanent or temporary migration side. If we look at the number of non-permanent residents living in Canada, StatsCan estimates this every quarter, it's now estimated, this is actually a few months ago, 2.7, 2.8 million people living temporarily in Canada. My guess is now up to close to 3 million. And that represents somewhere close to 7% of our total population. Clearly, as I mentioned, this has put tremendous pressure on housing, on the providing of health services, other services, and the government has decided they've got to do something about this under pressure, and has announced that they want to bring back the number of temporary residents to a level of 5% of our population over the next 3 years. What that means is there has to be a net outflow of temporary residents of somewhere around 600 to 700,000 over the next 3 years, if that target were to be met. There's some skepticism about whether the target's going to be met. When the Bank of Canada last announced their projections, they didn't actually buy into exactly the government policy. They didn't say they weren't buying it, but the numbers talk. So, that's on the non-permanent side. I mentioned on the permanent resident side, the targets are for 500,000 the next couple of years. There was some rumors out of the cabinet retreat in Halifax that those numbers may be reduced. So we'll see. My guess is they won't be reduced too much. I think those numbers will stay reasonably firm. The non-permanent numbers, if you assume the government will bring back to 5% over 3 years, as I mentioned, that means a net outflow of 650,000. We're starting to see in early data from May, June, that we have on immigration drop in students. And universities have reported, although we don't have firm data, that they see a 40% drop in international students. And we'll see that data reflected when we get it in the next couple of months. What that's going to mean for population growth, this is a projection we did, which built in that move to 5%. Growth will tumble from 2.5% to 3%, down below 1%. And in some areas, particularly, for example, in Toronto, growth could go negative if, in fact, they experience the same kind of a pattern. And in many urban areas, growth rates will come way, way down for 3 years before going back up. So, international migration, lower numbers we expect on the temporary side, hard to say on the permanent side, lower population growth. On the internal migration, my guess is recent patterns will probably stay the same. Migration to Alberta may pull back a little bit, the Atlantic region may pull back a little bit, but I think we'll see the same, but much, much lower growth right across the country. I'll leave it there, and I think we have 2 or 3 minutes if there are any questions, or be happy to talk to you later in the day if you had any questions.